and we'll also allow for some people to kind of roam the World Wide Web hallways as they try to find the room. And I mean, remember the days when you walk around the campus or wherever the conference is being held and you're looking at all the different signs trying to figure out where to go?
Those days were kind of nice, and maybe we'll see them again soon. I hope.
Okay. Thank you, Eric, for sharing that. And so, yep, we understand there's a lot of connectivity issues. So, all right, welcome. This is, we're at the top of the hour, and with Autumn, I will hand everything over to you to do the introduction so that we get it all clear and laid out. But I want to say it's a privilege and honor to be your Zoom room host. I'll be looking at the chat room and kind of keep monitoring questions and thoughts and ideas. And so with that, we'll let you get started.
All right, everybody, good afternoon. My name is Autumn Wright. I am a curriculum developer and teacher trainer at the Young-Do Institute of Foreign Language Education. And so, of course, with that, I'm very interested in developing curriculum, seeing what we can do for our students to make their lives maybe a little better and to make our lives as instructors and teachers easier. So today I will be talking about wide reading in the elementary classroom. So if you're interested, in the chat just now, I've put some notes that you can follow along with that I referenced some in my PowerPoint. You don't have to look at them, but if you're interested in having them even after the session, feel free, please treasure them. I spent time on them. All right. All right, can everybody see my screen? Okay, I got one thumbs up. So let's get into it. So today I want to talk about wide reading. In recent years, I think there's become a greater conversation about incorporating what we call extensive reading into the classroom, instead of learning more traditionally through textbooks all of the time. So when we talk about wide reading, we want to give students the time to read, encouragement to read, and lots of materials to read. When we wide read, we want students to read pleasurably at their own levels. Now, this often means that if it's possible, we should provide a variety of books to students in a variety of categories or genres, and at all different levels for students. We know that we have some students who might even struggle with phonics, and we know that some of us have very advanced students who are reading chapter books or longer novels, even in elementary school. When we talk about wide reading as something we want to incorporate into the curriculum, we don't necessarily want to test them or have any grades associated with this. So I'm sure that each of you, when you read yourself, you don't give yourself a test afterwards. This is very unnatural. And also it makes reading a bit less pleasurable than it otherwise would be. If students think I'm going to have a test, I'm going to get graded for this, they won't enjoy it as much. They might get stressed out about it. However, I know that many of you are probably required to give grades. So while I suggest, if it's possible, not to have tests or marks associated with wide reading, I know that it is not practical in every sense of the word. And finally, one of the most important things with wide reading is to build reading habits. The way it is now, many of our students will finish elementary school, finish middle school, finish high school, and they will have never read a full book in English. And then often they'll get to university or a higher level of education, and suddenly they're asked to read a novel. This is really, really difficult for them. When we think of reading and reading habits, it's a bit like going to the gym. If you go to the gym a little bit every day, you're going to build fitness over time. But if you decide that you're going to go to the gym one day and you're going to work out for 8 hours, I can almost guarantee you are not going to go to the gym the next day. You probably won't feel motivated to go to the gym for quite a long time because it's likely that you failed or that you're really sore, and that's not motivating to you. So when we build reading habits, we really want to get them started in elementary school. So when we think of reading in elementary school, we often think of picture books. And of course, picture books are great materials to incorporate. They are very appropriate for the elementary level. However, I don't think that we should just limit ourselves to picture books. We can think of things like graded readers, which if you have a multi-level classroom and can get multiple levels of the same book, that can be very encouraging. Chapter books, especially if you have higher level students who have studied at Hagwon, who have foreign parents, who have lived abroad. If you give them a picture book, they'll feel bored, maybe, or unengaged. And we do still want to engage our high level students. Newspapers or articles, they do make newspapers and articles for elementary schoolers and for language learners. So if you look at the Kids Times, is a newspaper geared at younger students with Korean language support. Nonfiction books, I myself am more of a nonfiction reader, and with young students, we often think they're interested only in fantasy and things that's not real, but that's not necessarily true. Graphic novels are a great way to bridge that gap between lower level picture books and chapter books. Even now, I'm sure that a few of you might read graphic novels, you might read mangas. So for high level students, they're great. And for low level students, we have the pictures that offer meaning. So what graphic novels do is they take out the long description passages and they transform them into a visual medium. So they're great for getting students to read, they're great for engagement, and they're just fun to read. I know when I am feeling a little brain dead by the end of the week, I prefer graphic novels over a real novel. Audiobooks or audio stories. So we often think of reading as solely a visual medium, but not all of our students can read visually or should be reading. Maybe they have some vision problems. Maybe they have issues like dyslexia. Maybe they just feel more engaged when they're listening. I know now many of my friends will listen to audiobooks instead of traditionally reading because they're busy or they need to do something with their hands. It's hard for them to concentrate. And so if we think of audiobooks or audio stories to incorporate into our classroom, we can really engage students who aren't so interested in traditional books. And also, when we think of wide reading, just pick whatever your students show interest in. If your student comes in the morning and says, I heard about this, or I wanted to share this, I think you should let them. I'm thrilled whenever my students show an interest in learning, whenever they show an interest in some materials in English. And when we give our students that freedom to choose and the freedom to share whatever they're interested in, it can be extremely motivating to them. Okay. I wanted to add, at any point, if anyone has any questions, you can just holler them out or put them into the chat. I know I'm going pretty fast because this started out as a 3-hour module and it's been squished down to 50 minutes. So let's talk about maybe why bother with wide reading. I know if you're teaching elementary or if you have an interest in elementary education within Korea, you are required to teach a textbook. And with this textbook, it can take a lot of time to try to work through it. When we think of wide reading, that can be a lot of extra work for you sometimes, if you think of it that way. But also with wide reading, we have a lot of benefits for our students. So the first thing I want to think about is that when we read a book, we have access, or we give our students access to other English speakers. Normally, when thinking of English in the elementary school, it's likely that there are maybe 1 or 2 English teachers. Maybe the students go to Hagwon, but it's likely that their English teacher is the only person that that student can engage with in English. Also, when students think of English, sometimes they only think of foreigners. However, when we look at picture books, when we look at books, we can find books written in English by Koreans. We can find books written in English by Gyopo. And this is very motivating to our students because they can see themselves, especially if we get books that feature Korean protagonists. Students can see themselves reflected in English texts. And really, don't doubt the power of that. Another great thing with wide reading, of course, is vocabulary reinforcement and vocabulary acquisition. When we think of vocabulary, the number of words that a student can learn through just reading is in the thousands. It's much more than you could teach just in school. We also have a lot of vocabulary words that don't come up that naturally in speaking or conversation, right? We have words that are mostly just read. We also have grammar. Of course, students can see new grammar patterns, but also they can see the grammar that they learned in class reflected back in the books that they read. And that will really help to get that grammar really packed into their brains a lot better. Which brings to the final point, language reinforcement. So we can teach our students things all day long, but if they don't use it, it will really just go in one ear, out the other. They have to get it resaid to them, redone constantly. Language is an ongoing process, and you really need to use it or you lose it, or you don't acquire it in the first place. And reading is one of the most practical things that we have in terms of language reinforcement, especially for non-native speakers. With books, students can read it again and again. They can look at passages over and over. You, as the teacher, can select books that directly go over a language point learned in class. So it really is quite beneficial in a lot of ways. All right, now that we've gone through that, let's talk about how can you actually build a reading habit. So my first little tip is to try, if it's possible, to give your students some choice in what they read. If you give them a choice, they will be much more likely to enjoy it. And I think, or rather, I have begun to do research, I have not completed this research, will be much more likely to comprehend it better. So if students are interested in something, if they're engaged with something, generally comprehension will be higher. I know if you were to give me a chemistry book, or if you were to give me a book about something really sci-fi, I probably wouldn't understand it that well. I wouldn't be that engaged with it. So did you get assigned some reading when you were in school? Probably, yeah. Did you have some books that you just really hated? Because I know that I did. And so when I got these books that I did not like in high school, or even younger than that, I wouldn't read them. I would go online and I would just search for the answers, which is not a great confession, but it's true. One of the most important things for building any habit is to try to be really steady with it. I would recommend having a set time every day or maybe every week to have students read. So maybe at the very beginning of every class, you can just set aside 5 minutes. And in that 5 minutes, students can read whatever they want. Or you can make it like a special day. So on Fridays, perhaps, Fridays can be your reading days. And students think that's more fun than the textbook. And the last point I have with building a habit is that you really have to be patient with this. I'm not going to lie to you. When you first start, this will be very difficult to do. Your students will say, oh, this is really hard. I can't read in English. I don't know how, teacher, I don't want to. But you really just have to stick with it. As your students get used to it, as they get more comfortable with it, they'll start to get used to this time. They'll get comfortable with it. They'll feel more comfortable with reading. And by the end of the year, they'll have read so many books. They will feel comfortable. They'll have this habit that can really go with them through the rest of their lives even. All right, have any of you heard of Dear Time? So Dear Time started, oh, Eric did. So Dear Time stands for Drop Everything and Read. It was a movement that kind of started within the US and has begun to become popular in other countries as well. So with Dear Time, Drop Everything and Read, we want to set a regular time, which for beginner readers should only be about 5 minutes. And this is for the same reason that I talked about at the beginning of this module, which is that if we have longer than 5 minutes, it's very difficult for beginner readers. Of course, over time, you can gradually increase this time. But when you start, 5 minutes tops. Dear Time should only be for reading. And this goes for you, the instructor, the teacher as well. So students should only be reading, not doing homework, not talking to their friends. And with that, you, the teacher, should not be grading papers. You really should be modeling good behavior for your students. This also serves as a great break time for you, the teacher. It's a great mental break to just stop teaching a lesson and be able to enjoy a book yourself. With Dear Time, we do, if possible, want to allow students to select their own books. Again, I know that there are sometimes logistical issues with this. If you're on Zoom, I would recommend maybe creating a Padlet, and you can upload PDFs of books. You can use websites like Epic Library to let students read. And if you're in person, what is, I think, really fun and what students enjoy a lot is if you can take them to the school library and let them select a book, maybe once every 2 weeks. I know that that isn't always practical to do. So what I like to do a lot is I like to get one of those white plastic baskets and I like to fill it with books, and I just like to put them on a table and let students pick whatever they want. I think with self-selection, it's also very valid to allow students to bring books from home or to find their own reading materials. So with Dear, with reading areas, so do any of you, when you read, do you read at your desk if you have the choice? I know when I read, I sprawl out on my couch, I'm on my back, I'm on my belly, I sit on my bed. I don't sit in my desk. It feels very unnatural and it's not that comfortable sometimes. And also when I read at my desk, I feel like I'm working because that's the only time I normally read. So if you can, if it's possible, if you can let your students read somewhere that is not their desk, if you can make an area on the floor, if you can decorate somehow, students really enjoy it. Oftentimes our students think if I'm at my desk, I'm working. If I'm not at my desk, that means I'm not working. So we can almost kind of trick our students into thinking that they are not doing work if they're not at their desk, even if they really are learning a lot. With Dear, we really want to foster pride in reading. We want to foster some responsibility. We want our students to be able to do this on their own some. And we'll talk about ways to build accountability in reading a little more later. And with Dear, so although students should mostly be reading independently, we as instructors, as teachers, do still want to check to make sure that our students fully comprehend what they're reading. We want to make sure that they are actually reading. Maybe you notice Suman in the back and her book is upside down and you think, that doesn't seem quite right. So we do need to check our students. And we can do this through a variety of reading strategies, which we'll go over now. So with our pre-reading strategies, let's go back a little bit. So pre-reading strategies are things that you should do before students begin to read. With pre-reading strategies, the main focus of it is to provide some background knowledge or some comprehension of the text before students begin to read. Pre-reading strategies can take a lot of different forms, and let's go over some of them. So I'm going to actually start from the bottom of this list. So a great pre-reading strategy is just to make bookmarks with your students. When students make a bookmark, they think, I'm getting ready to read. I'm going to be reading a lot. I'll need this bookmark. And in the notes that I sent in the chat at the very beginning, I have some examples of very interactive bookmarks that you can use with your students. So can you see this screen now? I'll zoom in a little bit. So these are some reading challenge bookmarks. So as your students complete each of these activities, they can quite simply color in what they have done. And when students have maybe colored in all of the pictures on a bookmark, they can maybe get some reward or they can get a new bookmark, and they can see how many of these reading challenges they've completed by the end of the year. Okay, and now I'll start from the top down. So other great pre-reading strategies are think alouds. So with a think aloud, all we want to do is look at the pictures of a book or even the cover and ask students what they think about it. So let's model a think aloud really quick. So I'm going to pretend that you are my very young students. So you can ask them things like, boys and girls, who is this? It's mom. Do you think mom is happy? No? Why not? So like I said, when we do a think aloud, all we want to do is to continue looking at these pictures. You can ask, is David a good boy or a bad boy? What color is it? Questions like how many? And these questions in a think aloud are engaging to both low level and high level students. When students orally say their answers, with high level students, we'll get longer answers, we can get sentences. With low level students, they can use individual words to answer very simple questions. The next reading strategy we have is a read aloud. So with a read aloud, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to X out of the PowerPoint. 1 second. Okay. So with a read aloud, what we want to do is we want to read a book aloud to our students. When I say we want to read a book aloud, though, I don't mean we just want to read the text. I mean that it's best if you read aloud the most dramatic way you have ever read a book in your life. So by the way we emote, by the way we use our faces, we use our bodies, we use our hands, students can get a lot of meaning. Even really, really low level students can understand if we move our bodies in certain ways. High level students can also be really engaged with seeing how funny the teacher is. So when we read aloud, you really have to go for it. I can almost guarantee that the first time you do a read aloud, you'll feel really silly, but it really is one of the best ways to build comprehension in students and to get them engaged. So if we go back to the same book, no, David, if I were reading this to students, you shouldn't be, no, David, no, David, no, 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 no. Reading like that is not necessarily that engaging. So students can still, of course, enjoy the pictures. This text, of course, is very simple, but students don't get the emotion of it. Students don't get how English is often inflected in the tones that we might use. If I were reading to my students, we would have things like, "Come back here, David." And every time you read, you do need to do this for enjoyment, for full comprehension. And the last thing I want to bring up is prediction. So with prediction, all we want to ask, we can look at the cover and we say, what do you think this book is about? What will happen? And students can often come up with pretty crazy answers to those very simple questions. All right, does anybody have any questions about pre-reading strategies? So these pre-reading strategies do work the best often if you're reading the same book for your entire class. However, they can be done on an individual level. So when you pass the book out, when a student chooses a book, if you do a think aloud, just ask them a question or two about the cover or have them reflect on the cover. Sometimes you don't even have to get an answer from them.
Autumn, a question back on those pre-reading. You make a pretty clear distinction between the think aloud and the predicting. I mean, it's clear that we, in your explanation here a little bit, but also for students, do you find that they are, it depends on the question with the think aloud, or?
It depends on the question. So with predicting, I would say it's best just to look at the cover often and to ask what happens. With the think aloud, we can look in the book a bit more and we can just ask other sorts of questions. Even questions like, what do you see here? Like, how many toys are there? Who is this? Are great for a think aloud. Does that answer your question? Kind of? Okay, great. All right, let's talk a bit about during reading strategies. For these, since we only have our students reading for maybe 5 minutes, we only sometimes want to check. So we do want to check probably at least once every couple of weeks, but we can't check our students every time. So a great during reading strategy is just asking comprehension questions. And these can be very, very simple. Like, who is the character? What is happening? Tell me something about the story. Another great during reading strategy is to have our students read aloud to us. So there's a large correlation in reading about words that students comprehend and words students are able to actually read aloud. And that's because English is not necessarily that phonetic of a language. For students to read aloud fluently, often they kind of need to know the word. It's very hard for them to sound out every word if they don't comprehend it. And the final during reading strategy that I would like to propose is to just have students paraphrase what is happening in the text. So this can be very, very simple. It can be one sentence or even just a couple of words. All that we're really checking for is that students have some idea of what is going on. And I would like to note that everything except for the student read aloud, the comprehension questions and the paraphrasing can be done in L1. They can be done in Korean. If students are reading, there's Of course, them speaking in English is good, but if we're just checking, we're not necessarily checking their speaking ability. So if you can, if you have the resources necessary, comprehension questions and paraphrasing in Korean are great to do. If your student's L1 is Korean, mine are. All right, let's talk a bit more about, oh, let's actually skip this. We don't have the time for this. Okay. So when we have completed a book, or when students have completed a book, we want to assess them somehow. We want to see that they actually read and that maybe it was meaningful to them, that they got some benefit from doing this reading. So the first very simple strategy that I can offer for after students reading a book is just to have them draw a picture. This is especially great for younger students, maybe 3rd or 4th grade. Older students can maybe add some sentences to this, and of course, higher level students can as well. So a higher linguistic level post-reading strategy would be to do a short written assessment. With written assessments, you can offer whatever level of scaffolding your students need. So of course, if you have really low level students, you can maybe just have them fill in a word or two of a sentence scaffold that you already made. If you have high level students, you can have them write a paragraph. You can have them do creative writing or do a poem of some sort. You can really do whatever you want with that. Predictions. And what I mean by predictions are to have students guess what will happen after the story ends. Predictions are a very natural post-reading strategy because I'm sure that all of us have made or have thought about what happens after the book that we're reading ends. Or if there's a second book in the series, we wonder what will happen in it. Which leads me to the 4th post-reading strategy, book discussions. Book discussions are maybe the most natural thing to do after we read a book. I know that when I read a book that I really enjoy or that I think is great, my first instinct is to tell my friends about it. I want to get other people to read it too. So when we discuss books, we, the teacher, can discuss the book with the students, or students can discuss the books together. You can make reading groups. You can have students discuss in pairs, just to have them tell each other what they read about. It's pretty fun to do. If you're online, again, you can make an account maybe with Padlet or with Goodreads or whatever you have and have students discuss books electronically. You can have them even make some short book reviews. And the last post-reading strategy I have is to make a graffiti wall. Are any of you familiar with graffiti walls? Probably not. So a graffiti wall is just a wall that looks like this. You can have students draw pictures of the book that they read. You can have them write the title. You can have them write some quotes. This one is quite a fancy, nice one. This one is a bit more casual, but this is a whole class effort that is really fun for elementary school students. It's very engaging. And of course, we all know that our students are very impressionable, especially younger ones. So if we have our students sign their graffiti walls, they'll see, Minho read this book, so I want to read the same book. So another great post-reading strategy is to let students select what they're going to do. So in the notes, I've included this on page 6. I couldn't quite fit in my PowerPoint very well. So you can make a chart like this, and you can either give it to your students or you can put it into your classroom. And with these charts, we can let our students pick whatever interests them the most to do. So they can write vocabulary words, they can write about the characters, they can make a comic strip. When I think about some assignments that I had to do in school, I remember really disliking some of them. I remember not wanting to do them because they didn't interest me. I know if somebody asked me to draw a comic strip about a book, I would hate it. I am so bad at drawing. I am not that creative artistically of a person. So if you asked me to draw a comic strip, I would probably shut down. But if I were given the option to read a nonfiction book and to write down 5 topics or 5 facts that I learned about that topic, I would really like to do that. As I mentioned, I really like nonfiction. I learning new facts. So I would be very motivated if I were given the choice to do that. So just like it's important to sometimes give our students the choice of which book they should read, it's also can be very motivating to them to give them the choice of what assignment they're going to do. It's something that we have often as adults, which is not offered to students nearly as much. And we are getting to the end. And one of the last things that I would like to say is that book recommendations are very motivating and powerful to students as well. In those, it's not on page 29. So in the notes, I've included a very simple book recommendation template, which you don't necessarily have to follow. So book recommendations can be done on both very high and low levels. They can be done either by writing, or again, you can do this as a speaking assignment. I like to do book recommendations as a written assignment because they make great things to put in your classroom. Other students can read it. If you do book recommendations on a Post-it note, you can put the Post-it note maybe even inside the book, and students can read that before they begin the book. Book recommendations like that can be done in Korean too. So, or again, L1. So, like I said, when we think of wide reading, we don't necessarily want to give our students marks. However, I do know that this is required sometimes. And I know that assessing students for reading can be very difficult if you don't give them something like a quiz afterwards. So with rubrics for reading, I have a couple of suggestions. My first suggestion would be to use a single point rubric. With a single point rubric, all you need to do is mark. So either they're at the level, right? Or maybe they're really good at this. So they participate well, but they always choose books that are way too easy for them. Single point rubrics can be marked very quickly and they're very efficient. If we have a more complicated rubric and you're trying to grade 30 kids on how well they did, that's going to take a lot of time. I also think that it builds a lot of responsibility and a lot of meaning to our students to have them assess themselves. So you can give your students a rubric. Even young kids can do this. Of course, this rubric that I'm showing you now that I included in the notes is in English. However, if you give this to your students, please put it in their L1 because they're just more likely to read it. So with this, if you give it to your students, you can maybe put it on a laminated paper and every time they can circle and erase. You can even give them some stickers if you want with these smiley faces on it. And students can just think, I did really well in this today, but I was kind of noisy. And many students, like I said, with this, they're building responsibility for their reading habits. And so over time, hopefully what we'll see is that they get better and better as they're forced to assess themselves with their reading as they work to become stronger and better readers. Okay, we only have a few minutes left, I think. So I would maybe like to have a brief reflection time. If anybody has any immediate thoughts about these questions. Did somebody say something?
I encourage you to either unmute or I'm checking over in the chat room. That's fine as well. I'm not sure if others have microphone problems or whatnot today, but yeah, please feel free to share and go ahead. Melvin mentions, I quite like the idea of the interactive bookmark.
Yes,
Nice.
so those interactive bookmarks, you can find a lot of templates online to use. And of course, the ones that I put in the notes, you can copy and cut out for your students. Again, interactive bookmarks can be something that you can also provide in L1 for students if they need.
Nice. Thank you, Mel. And see there, Eric mentions, I like the idea of the reading recommendations. That's something that I also kind of picked up on, and I would like to see how, do you display that publicly, or was that more of a kind of students hand to each other? Or
so if you hold on one second. So I have a Padlet with a lot of books on it. And I have some students who wrote their thoughts on these books. Let me see if I can log in from this computer. But I do like to display them publicly. So of course you might need to check to make sure that what your students wrote is appropriate. But most of the time it is. Most of the time with book recommendations, students are only going to write a recommendation if they really loved it or they really hated it. But even if they really hated it, most students are too polite to say that. All right, any other questions? I'm trying to log into the Padlet to see if I can show you, but.
yeah, we have a couple minutes if you want to try and find that. I've made the connection with Nikki Ashcroft had a presentation earlier about just belonging and community and making connections and helping to build the community. So like what Eric mentions there, yeah, a very meaningful activity that helps to foster that much more community and sharing. And Namiko, I see your hand is up. Go ahead and please share your comment question.
I have a question about the read aloud. I suppose
Yes.
it depends on your learner's language facility, but have you ever seen examples in Korea of, let's say, the ALT and the native Korean teacher working together to scaffold meeting during the read aloud? So it's like team teaching reading. So it's like a team read aloud.
I have tried this when I go to schools with Korean co-teachers.
Mhm.
So oftentimes, so if you're reading the book, you can have your Korean co-teacher providing some L1 language support if necessary.
Yes.
You can have your Korean co-teacher doing comprehension checks of some sort if necessary. But when we first start a read aloud, I generally like to just try to get through the book and then ask some
Mhm.
questions. But of course, you can do it in whatever way you think is appropriate for your students.
Okay, thank you. I guess the other question is, have you used original Korean stories that kids already know and then retell them in English?
No, I've not, but I think that's a great idea. In our library, we do have a lot of translated traditional Korean stories.
Hmm.
And then we have books like No Kimchi for Me, which
Okay,
is
cool.
written by, I think, a Korean American woman. But
Uh-huh.
of course, Korean students see themselves reflected in that.
Right, right.
Mm. So they already have a lot of meaning for it.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, Autumn, I'm gonna make sure that people know that we can wrap up, but I see you brought up the Padlet,
Yes.
and so I want to kind of offer a thank you, but also
Mhm.
we can hang out for a couple, 2, 3 more minutes after I wrap up the recording. So
Mhm.
just want to give a round of applause and a thank you to Autumn for the presentation. If you want to hang out here for a moment and have that discussion a little bit more, you're more than welcome to stick around. So thank you, Autumn, and we look forward to seeing you in the video that's going to be created and posted on IC 22, the international conference. And then also don't forget to check out the Discord conversations and some follow-ups,
Mhm.
sharing resources. So once again, thank you to all of you who are attending. Well, take care.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming.